Magic the Gathering is no stranger to powerful cards. It feels like there's one at least every set. Fable of the Mirror Breaker in Neon Dynasty and Leyline Binding in Dominaria United to name a few recent examples. But sometimes these powerful cards do way more than they should, so much so that they completely warped and broke an entire format around them if not more. This is not talking about cards that are just very good like Fetch Lands or the Evoke cards in Modern, but rather cards that affected their format so much, pretty much everyone was playing that card, or the deck that abused it, or a direct counter to those cards. Let's start with one of the more obvious cards, Oko, Thief of Crowns. Oko was so impressive in just about every format it was legal in, and it spanned just about everywhere except for Vintage and Commander. For just 3 mana, you essentially had a way to remove any powerful creature or artifact and turn them into a vanilla 3/3 elk. Any problem you had could be dealt with by turning it into an elk. Eldrazi, elk. Titan, elk. Moxus, elks. Yolanda, elks. This gained loyalty as well, instead of minusing it, making it even easier to keep Oko healthy to ensure your opponent just never had anything that wasn't a vanilla elk onto the battlefield. It wasn't uncommon for the first person to put Oko on the battlefield to win the game. Oko just did everything for just 3 mana. Recurable removal is just way too good. Even in the highest power format of Vintage, Oko still sees decent play in Bug and Planeswalker control decks. It's one of the best Planeswalker card ever printed and just one of the best cards ever, destroying almost every format it was legal in. In fact, it holds the record for the card being banned in the most formats. It only took a little over a month to be banned out of Standard, with only 2 extra months for Pioneer and 3 months for a Modern ban. Modern Horizons is one of the most controversial products. It's heavily criticized for making Modern have an unofficial rotation, putting incredibly powerful cards, like Ragavan and Wrenn of 6 into the format that are basically must-runs in the decks that can run them. However, we're going to hold off on talking about Modern cards for a little bit and head over to another format where decks cost less than 1 Commander staple, Pauper. That's right, it's time to talk about the Squirrel Infestation. For the unaware, Pauper is a format where only cards that are printed at the common rarity are legal. Among these was Chatterstorm, a 2-mana sorcery that creates a 1/1 squirrel token. It also had Storm, meaning that the spell is copied for every other spell you cast before that turn. This card did little in the other formats it's legal in, including Modern, the format it was designed for. However, in Pauper, it absolutely destroyed the metagame. It was so bad, Pauper players on Magic Online would protest by entering events with nothing but basic lands in their deck. And they won because the protesters ran into each other because so many people were fed up with Chatterstorm and Wizards' lack of interest in fixing Pauper. There was a near community-wide agreement that Chatterstorm was so oppressive, not playing the game was more fun than playing the game. The protest wound up being successful as a ban list was announced where Chatterstorm was banned. So why was Chatterstorm so good? Well, in Pauper, board wipes don't really exist. There are a few answers to it, such as Fiery Cannonade or Echoing Decay, which did see play in the side and in some cases the main deck. However, Chatterstorm decks also ran First Day of Class, which gave them all haste to be able to kill the opponent with scrolls before they ever had enough mana to cast the answers. Chatterstorm decks were basically all draw power and rituals that added mana to get to the combo and pump up the storm count for free. It was also boosted up by Galvanic Relay, another storm card to make the combo even more consistent and easier to get to. An important thing to note about Pauper for context is that one of the main aspects of the format is it has really good enablers. Cards like Dark Ritual, Lotus Petal, and Faithless Looting. What keeps the format in balance though is the payoffs are often weak. One of the best creatures at the time of recording is a 5/5 with War 2 and not much else. Sure, you can get it out quickly, but compared to the likes of Grizzleban and Murktide Regent, it's incredibly tame. So what often breaks Pauper is when a payoff is too good. This allows these old broken cards to make the deck very broken, and Chatterstorm is an example of a payoff being way too good. I mentioned this context so I can bring up another Pauper breaking card. Cards. Cards that give initiative. Getting to venture through the Undercity immediately was very good, especially in Pauper where there's little interaction that can stop it from happening. There's no force or will to prevent a creature that would give the initiative entering the battlefield, unlike something like a Legacy or Vintage. Once a player has the initiative, the only way to get it back is by dealing damage to them or taking the initiative yourself with a card that grants it. Especially with a card like Visage Battle Rager, which would also burn the opponent for a quarter of their life if it was ever blocked. Oh, and on the Undercity dungeon? A room that makes the opponent lose a quarter of their life. This means with Visage Battle Rager, it was not impossible to do half damage with just one creature. The initiative was so good in Pauper, nearly every creature that grants it was banned, with only Goliath Paladin and Avenging Hunter still legal at the time of recording this video, and both of them are still played in the decks that can run them. The black creatures in particular were among the best cards, since cards like Dark Ritual exist in the format that makes turboing them out very easy. Like Chatterstorm, the initiative was way too good of a payoff for the balance of pauper, and it completely warped the format around them. Let's move away from pauper for a bit. We can come back to it later because there's one more red-black seep I haven't talked about yet. Let's talk about some standards of the past, so let's start with some artifacts, and what better artifact to talk about than Skullclamp. This card is so good, it's banned in both Modern and Legacy. This card basically tells you you get to draw 2 cards for just 1 mana. Goblin decks at the time of Standard ran it so you could equip it to a creature that Skirk Prospector would sacrifice to make mana to equip it for free again, then you draw out a big chunk of your deck, especially with how good goblins were at flooding the battlefield. It was also dominant in Affinity, which oh boy, we'll get to that later. It was cheap to cast and turn any weak creature into a draw engine, and any deck that could flood the battlefield took immense advantage of it, especially in decks that could sacrifice for free to gain maximum value. It was a big menace in Affinity, as it also boosted up your Affinity count, which again we'll get to later. The engine was way too good, and it still sees plays in formats like Commander and even Vintage because of how much value it provides for such little cost. It was so good, in fact, Skullclamp only lasted about 100 days before it was banned out of Standard. Let's fast forward to a more recent addition to the game. Companions. Companions is one of the most busted mechanics in all of Magic's history. It's currently a 9 on the Storm scale, an unofficial scaling of how likely a mechanic is to return. Mark Rosewater himself said that Companions were one of the most unpopular mechanics he's seen since they started doing ratings for mechanics. For the uninitiated, Companions are cards that are put into your sideboard and can be used at any point. They all have a special restriction to deck building in order to use them as a companion, such as playing only 1 copy of all non-land cards in your deck or only cards with odd mana cost. The problem here is the decks they restrict you to synergize with the companion. By playing a companion, you automatically start the game with an extra card in your hand for essentially no real cost. Originally, you could cast the companion directly from your sideboard. A creature you always have access to was absurd, especially for companions like Lures of the Dream Den, which broke almost every single format in the game. Companion was so absurdly powerful, the entire mechanic had to be changed. Now you have to pay 3 mana to put it into your hand, and then you have to cast it normally. Even then, cards like Lewis were still incredibly powerful. It made many archetypes not want to run cards with 3 or more mana costs just so they could play Lewis, because it was just that good. Being able to recur cards for free like Mistress Bauble gave it immediate value. Pre-nerf Companion was so good, in fact, Lewis had to be banned out of Vintage for power level reasons, something that hadn't been done for over 2 decades, last seen in 1996, a time I wasn't even in existence yet. Normally in Vintage, cards are restricted, meaning you can only play 1 copy of them. However, doing that to Lewis wouldn't do anything since you only needed to play 1 anyways as your companion. It's since been unbanned since the companion nerf, but Lewis's power is not to be understated. Even with the addition of the companion tax, it is still one of the greatest mechanics to exist. A few other banned companions include Yorion in Modern and Zerda in Legacy, though their stories are a lot less interesting. There are many seasons of Magic where cards are discovered or released that completely change the game. We're going way back in time to 1996. For those of you who are around for Black Summer, I'm sorry for making you feel old. As I mentioned before, I quite literally did not exist during this time, so sorry if I get anything wrong. Black decks dominated the metagame of the summer of 1996, hence the name of Black Summer. But what caused it? Well, a little card called Necropotence. It was actually released a year earlier in 1995, and most people at the time wrote off the card entirely, and it was near universally panned. However, it suddenly began popping up, and people began to realize that despite the loss of life it gave you, having access to a bunch of cards was worth the trade-off. After all, life doesn't matter until it hits 0. Some players would even play Ivory Tower just to counteract this life loss. It was bolstered up due to the restriction of one of the best answers to the card Black Vise, before Necropotence rose up in the ranks. Necropotence let you practically guarantee you'd be able to draw into your main card you needed to win the game, and that made the life loss trivial when you'd be able to win the games with the cards you just drew. Necropotence was super dominant, and decks began to pop up all over the place, and it dominated for the entire summer before Wizards decided to intervene and restrict the card. Necropotence remains banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage to this day. Staying back in the past, let's look at another powerhouse of a deck, the Academy deck. This deck is named after the star land Tolarian Academy, one of the best, if not the best land ever printed. It added blue mana based on how many artifacts you control. The deck was built around using Stroke of Genius to mill your opponent, using free mana rocks along with cards like Windfall to cycle through your deck to find it along with Mana Over Matter, which could be used to untap Tolarian Academy repeatedly. Thanks to the wheel cards, it was trivial to draw into the cards you need, and with how many mana you had from Tolarian Academy, it was very easy to just cast your entire deck at any point. It is widely considered to be one of the best decks ever, as it could win on the first turn with how fast and consistent it was. There was very little reason to play much else when Academy was such a strong deck. It was so powerful, in fact, the deck only lasted 50 days before Intervention came, with Tolarian Academy, Windfall, and Stroke of Genius all being banned for power level concerns. While Stroke of Genius was eventually unbanned, Windfall remains banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage as long with Tolarian Academy. This deck was the start of Combo Winter, where for a whole season combo decks just reigned supreme, with a new broken combo deck replacing the ones that just got banned. With the return to New Phyrexia upon us at the time of recording, let's take a look at one of the most broken mechanics ever printed, Phyrexian Mana. Phyrexian Mana is a special kind of mana that can be paid for the regular colors it would need, or it can be substituted with 2 life for each mana. Enter Mental Misstep, one of the most broken counterspells ever printed. It completely warped just about every format it was legal in, and is banned in Legacy, restricted in Vintage, and was even preemptively banned from Modern when the format was being created. Being able to shut down your opponent's 1-drop was incredibly good and a huge tempo swing. Since you didn't need to pay actual mana, you would always be able to cast it. Even though its targets were theoretically narrow, a Mental Misstep could win you the game. It became a game of chicken, having to hold back until you had your own Mental Misstep to counter your opponents. It was essentially who had access to more copies of it won the game. The entirety of the early game was shut down because of Mental Misstep, and everyone was running playsets just to be ensured you would be able to counter other Mental Missteps. It was the most free counterspell ever printed, and while free and quotational counterspells exist like Force of Will, the cost is much more than simply paying 2 life, which is why Mental Misstep was as broken as it was and why it dominated so hard and completely warped the format it was involved in. Staying in the same plane but even further back, let's venture into Mirrodin, with one of the most busted mechanics ever printed, Affinity. Affinity discounted your spells based on how many artifacts you control, with each one making the spell cost 1 less. This dominated the Mirrodin standard. The artifact lands made the deck incredibly powerful, as something as simple as playing a land would boost up your affinity count. You were able to cast multiple creatures on your first turn, and with Chrome Marks legal, you could bring out an Arcbound Ravager, one of the best cards of the format, on turn 1. It was an artifact creature too, adding to your affinity count even more. Cards like Thoughtcast could be cast for 1 mana, and Frogmite and Mirror Enforcer cast for free. Affinity was also largely boosted up by Skullclamp. Hey, remember that familiar? It let you gain a ton of cards by sacrificing your creatures to Arcbound Ravager, and with Disciple on the Vault on the field, this meant your opponent was getting hurt by it while you drew more cards to get more plays and extenders into your hand. It was incredibly easy to close out games with this burn as well as Shrapnel Blast. Affinity was capable of winning the game in just a few turns, which is very fast for the format at the time. Affinity was so oppressive at this time, there was a mass exodus of players leaving the game. Though it bounced back, Affinity forever left its mark as one of the most broken mechanics in the game. So much so that when Modern was created, all of the artifact lands were preemptively banned, with Darksteel Citadel being the only one still playable. However, artifact lands would make a return to the products we already talked about, Modern Horizons 2. And like the last time I talked about it, I'm not going to be talking about its effect on Modern, but Pauper, sorry. And what happened there were the indestructible artifact dual lands. This caused the Pauper Affinity deck to skyrocket to the top of the metagame. It not only allowed Affinity to easily run multiple colors, but it prevented common artifact removal from being used against them. It was so oppressive, players remained decking Dust to Dust just to counteract the indestructible artifact lands. Like in the standard before, Affinity and Pauper did much of the same, using artifact lands to build up Affinity to then bring out cards like Mirror Enforcer and Frogmite for free, while using cards like Galvanic Blast has both efficient burn and removal. Affinity was bolstered even higher thanks to Sojourner's Companion, which let you cycle for any artifact land for just 2 mana for easy color fixing. It was eventually banned, but the power of the Fling plus ATOG combo proved to be way too much for the format, also boosted up by the artifact lands. Unless you counted ATOG at slow for Fling, you were simply dead with no way to respond, even if you had removal for ATOG since the combo was at instant speed. Often Affinity decks even play counterspells just to ensure their combo wouldn't be countered, making it one of the most oppressive decks in the format. Affinity had absurd draw power, consistency, and color splashability, able to run 3 colors with each was something most Pauper decks aren't capable of. While the artifact lands are still around, ATOG did hit the Bant Hammer, and Affinity got kind of reined in and is kind of more in a healthy place now. I've done enough mentioning of Modern and Modern Horizons without actually talking about the format, so let's break that ice and talk about Hogaak. Hogaak, Arisen Necropolis, was very easy to bring out with things like fetch lands in the format, making it trivial to set up your graveyard. It wasn't too hard to bring out Hogaak incredibly early, and an 8/8 with Trample on turn 2 was nothing to scoff at. Graveyard hate wasn't the greatest in Modern at the time, and it allowed Hogaak to be incredibly consistent. The deck could easily set up the graveyard with Stitcher Supplier and Altar of Dementia, repeatedly milling yourself. Add in Bridge from Below, you often won the game with ease. Hogaak decks were dominant, able to dig for combo pieces thanks to Faithless Looting and Insolent Neon Knight, which also helped dump Bridge from Below into the graveyard while getting the cards you want into your hand. It didn't matter if Hogaak got milled either, since you were able to still cast it from your graveyard. As if having Delve wasn't good enough, it had Convoke as well, using your generally useless creatures after their Enter the Battlefield effect goes away to cast Hogaak quicker. Hogaak was way too broken for Modern, being out of the format only 2 months after its release. The deck was immensely successful in the summer it was legal in, and the card even sees vintage play for how strong it is. Speaking of old formats, let's move over to Legacy, specifically the Flash and Hulk combo. The deck was so incredibly oppressive, it was banned out of the format after just one event. However, we do need to talk about Flash. The card was actually errated, and the text it got would not put the creature onto the battlefield unless you paid the reduced cost, and if you didn't, it would just be sent to the graveyard directly. However, this errata eventually got reversed, and that's when the combo with Protean Hulk came to fruition. Both cards existed at the same time, but it wasn't until the reversal of errata they did something. The deck would put Protean Hulk onto the battlefield, which would immediately be sacrificed. Then you would switch Disciple of the Vault and artifact creatures with X casting costs that would immediately die when entering the battlefield, burning your opponent for lethal, something that could be done literally on turn 0 if you open Gemstone Caverns. The entire combo was also at instant speed, making it almost impossible to interact with and completely dominating Legacy for the very brief time it was legal. Another blast from the past comes from an equipment, Umezawa's Jitte. At first glance, this card may not seem very special. It's an equipment that costs 2 mana to get equipped. It can either boost up stats for a turn, minus stats, or gain life. So why was it so good? Well, it basically made it so you won any combat with any creature. Every time the equipped creature attacked, it got 2 counters. This could make the creature it was attached to into a 4/4 when it attacked, or make the creature blocking -2/-2. The effect wasn't once per turn, so you could stack the effects to deal massive damage if there was no blockers, or guaranteed you'd be able to beat over the blocker your opponent used. It completely warped how combat and creatures function, with Umezawa's being a Swiss army knife of effects, capable of removing counters based on whatever you needed at a time. Umezawa's Jitte was so good, even decks that couldn't use it to its potential were still playing it, because back in the day, there could only be one copy of a legendary card on the field, meaning by playing an Umezawa's Jitte, you would destroy your opponent. It was that much of a problem. It left a huge impact on the standard it was around for, and because of it, it was preemptively banned when Modern was created, and remains bad to this day. It still even sees some niche Legacy play to this day. We talked about Black Summer, so it's hard to not also talk about Eldrazi Winter. We're going back to Modern, specifically to the age of the Oath of the Gatewatch, where some of the best Eldrazi cards were printed. It bolstered up notably the Eye of Ugin, which discounted all Eldrazi by 2. This effect stacked, so 2 Eye of Ugins in play were the equivalent of essentially having 4 lands. This could be pushed even further with Eldrazi Temple, which when casting colorless Eldrazi tapped for 2 mana instead of just 1. This made casting Eldrazi trivial. Bringing out Thought Not Seer early helped to exile a potential counter or the opponent's own Eldrazi from the game. You could bring out Reality Smasher easy for a Trample Haster that could start swinging in early. You could also cast Eldrazi Mimic on turn 1 with these cards, which when combined with Thought Not Seer and Reality Smashers made it very easy to deal massive damage by turn 3, even maybe winning the game by that point. It was during the Battle for Zendikar block that the cheap Eldrazi entered the game and bolstered up Eye of Ugin to dominating levels. It led to almost everyone jumping on the Eldrazi train or just losing. It destroyed the meta, with an absurdly high win percentage and tournament places. The deck lasted 4 months for an entire winter before finally getting hit by the banhammer, with Eye of Ugin banned out of Modern. Eye of Ugin is a case of a card being mostly harmless until powerful payoffs came that broke the card in half, and in turn, Modern as a format. There are definitely more cards I could talk about, but this video is running a bit long, so let's conclude with a card that was so powerful, it threatened to prolong the combo winter I mentioned earlier. It was so powerful, it was banned after only 1 event appearance and 2 weeks of existence. I'm of course talking about Memory Jar. The deck it was played in wasn't named Broken Jar because people just knew how broken it was. Memory Jar makes everyone exile a hand and draw 7 cards. The combo was protected from counterspells by Defense Grid, which made any kind of interaction cost 3 extra mana during your turn. The deck played a ton of cheap fast mana, such as Mox Diamond, Mana Vault, Lotus Petal, and Lion's Eye Diamond. This was before any of these cards were restricted, allowing for a ton of mana to be played early to turbo Memory Jot onto the battlefield. This was complemented with Megrim, which when discarding the hand would burden the opponent. It wasn't uncommon to chain multiple Memory Jots together, causing multiple triggers of the discard with Megrim on the field, casting wins as early as turn 1 with the right hands. Much of the deck became either banned or restricted, with Memory Jot eating a ban almost immediately, one of the quickest bans in Magic history. Rivaled only by Tibalt's Chicory at 10 days in Modern, Mind's Desire at 6 in Legacy and Vintage, and Lutri the Spell Chaser being banned before it was even released. Granted, Lutri is just a free extra commander, and Mind's Desire was immediately seen as being a problem before it had any real major impact. Tibalt's Trickery was mostly due to silly rulings with Cascade that have since been changed. Stopping there seems like the nice place to stop. There were plenty of cards I looked over, like Fall from Favor and Pauper, Omnath Locus of Creation and Standard, but I didn't want this running longer than it already is. There are plenty of Magic cards that have completely broke formats and centered themselves around an entire format. Design mistakes happen, some are just more mistakey than others. Let's say that was profound enough for an outro. I've been JPEG, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Who knows, there's certainly plenty of other cards that broke formats, so subscribe if you don't miss it if I decide to do a part 2. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.